I remember the day I first walked into that old church. The place had been left untouched for years, buried under layers of dust and time. The boards creaked under my feet, and the air smelled stale, like wood left to rot. There was nothing immediately unusual about it. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. I was an architect, after all. I'd restored plenty of buildings like this one, places that seemed haunted only because they were neglected. But this church, something felt different, though I didn't want to admit it at first. As I started working, everything seemed routine. I made notes of what needed repair, checked the structure, and sketched out plans to bring it back to life. But then, during the second week, I found the box. It was small, hidden between the beams in the attic, old, wooden, and sealed tight with rusted nails. It wasn't even on my radar to open it right away. I left it aside, focused on the job, and ignored the strange pull it had on me. That night, though, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Something about its hidden placement gnawed at me, as if it had been left there for a reason, or worse, as if someone had deliberately tried to hide it. The next day, I gave in. I pried open the box carefully, expecting to find maybe old letters or church documents. Instead, there were these Polaroids, dozens of them, faded, curling at the edges, but still clear enough to see what they captured. At first, I thought they were just photos from the congregation, people attending services, sitting in the pews. But the more I looked, the more disturbing they became. The expressions on the faces were wrong. Some people looked terrified, others vacant, as if they weren't even there. Children stared blankly at the camera, eyes hollow. And then there were the pictures of the altar. I can't quite describe it, but something about the way it was framed, the way shadows played across it, made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, or the age of the photos playing with my mind. I tried to focus on my work, but the images stuck with me. That night, alone in the church, I started hearing things. Footsteps when I was the only one there. I looked around, trying to find a source, but there was nothing. Just me and the church's endless creaking. "Get a grip, Daniel," I muttered under my breath. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not anymore. The following day, I decided to dig into the church's history. It wasn't hard to find old newspaper clippings, archived reports of its past. It turned out there had been a priest here decades ago. Father Rourke. He was well known back in the day for performing exorcisms. The church had attracted people from miles around, families desperate for help, bringing their sick and disturbed to him. But something had gone wrong. In 1975, after one particularly intense exorcism involving several children, Father Rourke disappeared, along with most of his congregation. The reports were vague, just whispers of what might have happened. No bodies were ever found, and the church was shut down shortly after. The more I learned, the more I felt drawn back to the Polaroids. They weren't just random snapshots. They were documenting something. Some sort of ritual, a ceremony maybe. The altar looked different in the photos, like it was prepared for something dark. And those people, they weren't praying. They were part of whatever Father Rourke had been trying to do. I wondered how the photos had ended up in that box, hidden so far out of sight. Was someone trying to forget what happened here? Or was it a warning? My thoughts started to spiral. The footsteps, the photos, the history of this place. It was all too much to be a coincidence. I began seeing things out of the corner of my eye, figures, flickers of movement. I'd turn, but nothing would be there. I started sleeping less, staying up late, obsessively going through the photos again and again. I wasn't working anymore. Not really. I was just there, in that church, night after night, waiting. For what? I didn't know. And then came the final photo. It was in the bottom of the box, stuck under the others. I must have missed it the first time. When I pulled it out, my heart sank. It was a picture of me, standing right where I was, in that damn church, holding a camera, staring back at myself. My face was twisted with fear, my eyes wide, as if I knew something terrible was coming. And then I flipped it over. On the back, in faded, smudged handwriting, were the words, "You are next." I dropped the photo. My hands were shaking. I looked around, suddenly hyper-aware of everything, the creak of the floorboards, the shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. It wasn't just a story. This was real. I wasn't just uncovering the church's dark past. I was becoming part of it. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the photo in my hand. My own face, twisted with fear, seemed foreign to me, like I was looking at a stranger. How was this even possible? The photo showed me in the same clothes I was wearing that day, in the same church. But I hadn't taken it. No one else had been there with me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Something or someone was watching. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling. I forced myself to leave the church for the night. The air outside was cold, but it felt better than being inside. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed a line, that opening that box, looking at those photos, had set something in motion. Back at my apartment, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of the church, the faces in the Polaroids, the empty eyes of those children. And then, always, that final image, me, staring back in horror. I kept hearing that voice in my head, "You are next." The next morning, I told myself I wouldn't go back. I could quit the project, tell the client there were structural issues, something too dangerous to fix. But as the day wore on, I knew I was lying to myself. The pull was still there. The church, the box, the photographs, they had a hold on me now. I had to know more. I had to figure out what was happening, even if it terrified me. By the time I arrived at the church again, it was late afternoon. The shadows stretched long across the floor, giving the place an even more unsettling vibe. I told myself I'd just do a quick walkthrough, check on some of the repairs, then leave. But as soon as I stepped inside, it felt like the temperature dropped. I could hear my own footsteps echoing against the stone walls, each one sharper, louder than it should have been. And then there was a faint sound, a creaking noise, like someone walking upstairs. "Hello?" My voice cracked in the emptiness. No response. I stood frozen, waiting for something, anything to happen. The sound stopped, but the air felt charged. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the stairs to the attic. Every step felt heavier than the last. I reached the top and swung the light around the room, half expecting to see someone standing there. But it was just the same dusty attic, the rafters creaking under the weight of the years. Then, something caught my eye. Near the spot where I'd found the box, there was a faint outline on the floor, almost like a circle had been drawn in the dust. Kneeling down, I traced it with my fingers. It felt cold, unnaturally so, like the wood had absorbed something far more sinister than just dust and decay. My mind raced. Was this where the rituals took place? The ones from the photos? The idea sent a chill down my spine. "Don't be stupid," I muttered under my breath. I tried to shake it off, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. I stood up and backed away from the circle, keeping the flashlight trained on it, as if expecting it to move. I needed to get out of there, but as I turned to go back downstairs, I heard it again. Footsteps. But this time, they weren't mine. They were slow, deliberate, coming from behind me. I whipped around, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand, but there was no one there. Just the empty attic. The sound stopped, but the pressure didn't. My skin tingled, like the air was charged with static. Something was wrong. I bolted down the stairs, practically running out of the church. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath, trying to convince myself I was still sane. But the feeling wouldn't leave me. That circle, those footsteps, the Polaroids, they were all connected. I couldn't shake the sense that I was being drawn deeper into something far worse than I could understand. Later that night, back in my apartment, I couldn't stop pacing. I needed answers. The next logical step was to find out more about Father Rourke, the priest who had vanished. His name came up in every article I found about the church's history, but there was so little concrete information. One piece, though, stood out: a rumor that the exorcisms Rourke had performed weren't authorized by the church. He'd gone rogue, convinced that something evil had taken root in Charleston. That something had possessed the children. I kept thinking about those kids in the photos, their empty eyes, their faces twisted in terror. What if Rourke hadn't been trying to save them? What if he had been trying to trap whatever was inside them? The idea clawed at my mind. What if that ritual wasn't an exorcism, but something darker? Something meant to contain or even summon something else? And now, here I was, alone, with the same entity that had driven Rourke and his congregation to their doom. I didn't want to believe it, but the signs were all there. The footsteps, the photos, the voice telling me I was next. It wasn't just in my head. Whatever had been in that church all those years ago hadn't left. It was still there, waiting, watching. And now, I was part of its game. The more I thought about Father Rourke, the more obsessed I became. His name kept circling in my mind like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. I had to know more. What happened to him? Why did the exorcisms go so wrong? There was something sinister lurking beneath the surface of his story, something nobody had wanted to uncover. But now I didn't have a choice. The church wasn't letting me walk away, and neither was whatever had haunted those walls for decades. I needed to dig deeper. I found myself back at the church the next morning. I don't even remember driving there. I just arrived, as if something had pulled me in. My steps felt heavier, each one echoing off the cracked stone floor. I'd brought my laptop, hoping to search more about Rourke's disappearance. But as soon as I sat down at one of the old pews, I realized the Wi-Fi signal had completely dropped. There was no way to connect out there, which left me with only one option: head back to the local library, where I could access their archives. I hated leaving the church, but I knew I needed answers if I was going to survive whatever this was. The library was practically empty. I sat down at a dusty computer terminal and started typing in every keyword I could think of. Father Rourke, the church, exorcisms in Charleston. Most of it was the same recycled information I'd already found, until I stumbled on an old article from 1976. It described Rourke's final months in the church, how he had become obsessed with a group of children who had been brought to him by desperate parents. They weren't possessed, according to the article, at least not at first. But something changed during the exorcisms. The parents reported their children becoming distant, vacant, as if whatever Rourke had tried to expel had, instead, entered them. I felt a cold sweat break across my skin as I read on. Rourke had disappeared one night, along with the children. They were never found. The article mentioned rumors of strange rituals, but nothing concrete. No bodies, no real proof. Just whispers of something dark and ancient that had taken root in the church. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, trying to piece it all together. Rourke had tried to banish something, but instead, he'd unleashed it. And now I was standing at the edge of that same abyss, staring into whatever he'd faced. When I returned to the church, it was nearly dusk. The air felt thick, almost like it was pressing against my skin. I didn't need the Polaroids to remind me of the horror that had unfolded here. I could feel it. Every inch of the place seemed to hum with some unseen energy, something old and angry. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I knew I couldn't turn back. I had to keep going. I made my way to the attic again, flashlight in hand. The circle was still there, faint but visible. I crouched down beside it, feeling a strange urge to touch it, like it was calling me. But I stopped myself, gripping the edge of the flashlight until my knuckles turned white. I could almost hear Rourke's voice in my head, warning me, "Don't let it in." I stood up, suddenly aware of how alone I felt. I hadn't seen another person in days. It was like the world outside the church had stopped existing. Then I heard it again, those footsteps. This time, they weren't upstairs. They were coming from behind me, down in the nave. I froze, listening, heart pounding in my chest. Someone was walking around in the dark, slowly, deliberately. I turned off my flashlight, trying to make myself as invisible as possible. Whoever, or whatever, was down there didn't need to know I was watching. I crept to the edge of the stairs, peeking down into the shadows below. There was no one there, but the footsteps continued, louder now, echoing through the empty space. "Who's there?" I whispered, more to myself than anything else. No answer. Just the sound of those steps, pacing as if waiting for me to make the first move. My mind raced. Had Rourke returned? Was he still trapped in this church, walking the same cursed path over and over? I gripped the railing, my palms slick with sweat. I knew I had to go down there, but every instinct screamed for me to run. Leave. But I couldn't. Something was holding me here, forcing me to see this through to the end. I took the stairs slowly, one step at a time, flashlight in hand, but turned off. The footsteps stopped as I reached the bottom. I stood there in the silence, feeling my heart thudding against my ribs. I didn't want to call out again, but I felt the need to break the tension. "I know you're here," I said, my voice shaking. Still nothing. just the sound of my own breathing, loud in my ears. I swung the flashlight in a wide arc, sweeping the beam across the empty pews. There was nothing, no one, but then something flickered at the far end of the church, a shadow, darting between the columns. My breath caught in my throat. I clicked the flashlight off again, standing in the darkness, waiting. I wasn't alone, not anymore. I stood there, frozen, listening. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen or thought I'd seen. That shadow had moved. It wasn't just my imagination. Someone, or something, was with me in the church. My mouth went dry. I kept the flashlight off, standing in complete darkness, the silence around me suddenly unbearable. My hands were shaking, and my grip on the flashlight felt weak, like my body was betraying me. I took a slow breath, trying to calm my nerves. You have to stay in control, I told myself. But control felt impossible. Every instinct screamed for me to leave, to run, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I needed to know what was happening. I needed to see it, to confront it, even if that meant staring into something I couldn't understand. My feet moved on their own, taking a step forward, then another. The soft creak of the old wooden floor sounded too loud, like it was announcing my every movement to whatever was hiding in the shadows. The flashlight hung heavy in my hand, still off. I couldn't bring myself to turn it on. Part of me didn't want to see what might be lurking in the darkness. The shadow had been fast but unmistakable. There was someone, or something, down at the far end of the church, between the pews, just out of my sight. The air felt thick as I approached, like it was pressing against me, slowing me down. I had to force each step forward, muscles tight with tension, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. When I reached the row of pews, I paused, listening again. There was nothing. No movement, no sound. My mouth opened, but no words came out. My throat felt like it had closed up, as if speaking would somehow make everything more real. I couldn't just stand there, though. Slowly, I raised the flashlight and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the shadows in front of me. The light trembled with my unsteady hand as I swept it across the rows of seats. Empty. Every pew, every corner. Nothing. A wave of relief washed over me for a split second, but it didn't last. I knew what I'd seen. My brain was screaming that something was wrong. I could feel it in the air, in the way the church seemed to shift around me, like it was alive. My breath came in shallow bursts, and I forced myself to step forward again, closer to the altar. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing perfectly still right next to the pulpit. The beam of my flashlight caught it for only a second before it disappeared again, melting into the dark. "No," I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible. My pulse raced, panic tightening its grip on me. I took a step back, then another. The flashlight beam danced erratically, shaking as my body started to lose control. The figure hadn't moved, but it had been there. I'd seen it. A man, or something resembling a man, just standing there, waiting, watching. I turned, stumbling toward the exit, my legs barely keeping up with the surge of adrenaline. I couldn't stay in there another second. As I reached the door, my hand fumbled with the latch, my mind still processing what I'd seen. And then the footsteps started again. This time, they weren't slow. They were coming straight for me, fast, deliberate, closing the distance between us in seconds. I threw myself through the door, into the cold air outside, slamming it shut behind me. I stood outside, chest heaving, heart thudding painfully in my chest. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of it all. I'd never felt anything like that before, like I was being hunted. I knew then that this wasn't just some leftover energy from a ritual gone wrong. This was alive, it was following me, and I was in way over my head. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. Once inside, I locked the doors and sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to catch my breath. My mind kept replaying the image of that figure near the altar, the way it seemed to watch me without moving. It hadn't attacked, it hadn't said anything, it just waited. What was it waiting for? I started the car, hands still shaking, and drove without any clear direction. I couldn't go back to my apartment. The idea of being alone in that small, enclosed space felt unbearable. I kept driving, not sure where to go, my thoughts racing as fast as the car. Was I losing it? Or was this thing real, tied to that church, tied to those Polaroids, to Father Rourke's twisted legacy? I couldn't escape the feeling that I'd crossed a line, that whatever had happened to those children was now happening to me. I pulled over to the side of the road, my mind still buzzing. I couldn't stop thinking about Rourke, the way he had disappeared. What if he had never left? What if that figure in the church was him, or what was left of him? I sat in the car for what felt like hours, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The engine was still running, headlights cutting through the darkness, but I couldn't move. My mind raced in circles, replaying every moment in the church. The figure, the footsteps, the feeling that something was there, waiting for me, drawing me deeper into whatever hell Rourke had left behind. I should have gone home, but home didn't feel safe anymore. Nowhere did. Eventually, I found myself driving again, not toward my apartment, but back to the church. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I wasn't thinking at all. Maybe I just needed to face it, to see whatever this was through to the end. My body moved automatically, taking turns I didn't consciously choose. By the time I reached the gravel lot outside the church, my hands were trembling, my heart pounding in my chest. The place stood before me, dark and silent, like a tomb waiting to be opened. I sat there, staring at the entrance, trying to convince myself to leave. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were inside. The final piece of the puzzle was waiting for me, hidden somewhere in the darkness. I grabbed the flashlight from the passenger seat and stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at my skin. The church loomed ahead, the wooden doors slightly ajar, as if they'd been waiting for my return. I hesitated, staring at the gap between the doors. Something was off. I hadn't left it open. Swallowing hard, I stepped inside. The air felt thick again, pressing against me like an invisible weight. I didn't bother with the lights this time. The flashlight was enough. Its beam flickered as I moved through the empty nave, the old floorboards creaking beneath my feet. Everything looked the same, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My pulse quickened, every shadow seeming to move in the corners of my vision. I reached the altar where the figure had stood before. The pulpit was empty now, just as I'd expected. But something else caught my eye. On the ground, right in front of the altar, was the box. The same wooden box I'd found in the attic, only now it was down here, placed directly in my path. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't brought it down. I hadn't touched it since that first day. So why was it here? I crouched down, my fingers brushing against the worn wood, feeling the coldness seeping through it. I opened the lid, half expecting to see the Polaroids again, but the box was empty, completely empty. I sat back on my heels, confusion swirling in my head. Something wasn't right. Then I noticed it, a folded piece of paper tucked into the corner, as if it had been left there deliberately. My hand shook as I reached for it, unfolding it slowly. The handwriting was old, faded, but I could still make it out. One line, scribbled hastily, "He never left." My stomach lurched as the words sank in. Rourke, the priest. He hadn't disappeared. He was still here, trapped, or worse, consumed by whatever dark force he'd tried to fight. I stood up quickly, backing away from the altar, the flashlight beam shaking. That's when I saw him. At first it was just a shadow, barely visible in the dim light. But as I stepped back, the figure took shape. Tall, cloaked in darkness, standing at the far end of the aisle. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't just a shadow. It was him, Rourke, or what was left of him. His face was pale, gaunt, eyes hollow but locked on mine. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, watching me, like I was the next part of his ritual. My breath caught in my throat as the realization hit me. The rituals hadn't failed. They'd succeeded. Rourke had summoned something, but instead of banishing it, he'd become part of it. And now it had chosen me. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. It clattered to the floor, spinning in a circle, casting frantic beams of light around the church. But when I looked up again, Rourke was gone. The aisle was empty, the church silent. I grabbed the flashlight, heart racing, and ran for the door. As I reached for the handle, I felt something cold brush against my skin, like a hand gripping my wrist. I yanked the door open and bolted into the night. I didn't stop until I was in my car, gasping for breath, staring at the church. The door was wide open, and I could still feel the cold touch on my wrist, like a brand, like I'd been marked. I knew then that it was over. I wasn't going to escape this. The church hadn't let Rourke go, and it wasn't going to let me go either. I wasn't just next, I was already part of it. It all started about 2 months after we moved into the house. At first, I didn't think much of it, just the excitement of settling in, new routines, getting used to the quiet streets of Albany. But then something changed. Every night, like clockwork, I noticed the curtain in the house across the street. Not fully open, not fully closed, just enough to see a crack of darkness through the window. I'd glance over while turning off the lights, and it felt like someone was watching. I didn't say anything to Mark at first. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but then it became a habit. Every night, the same curtain, the same narrow opening. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but that feeling, it didn't go away. I started leaving the lights on longer than usual, pretending to tidy up just to see if the curtain would move. It never did, at least not when I was looking directly at it. But the sense of being watched, it grew stronger every night. I couldn't shake it anymore. One night, I casually mentioned it to Mark as we were getting ready for bed. "Have you noticed the curtain across the street? The one in the bedroom window? It's always slightly open around this time." He shrugged it off, not even looking up from his phone. "Babe, it's probably just the wind. Or maybe they leave it like that on purpose. Why are you even paying attention to their window?" I laughed it off, but deep down, his dismissal frustrated me. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't just a random quirk. I could feel eyes on me. I started to avoid looking directly at the window, but even when I wasn't, I could sense it. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch. The following days didn't make things easier. I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, convinced someone was following me. When I walked to the grocery store or took a jog around the block, I had this nagging sense that someone was just a few steps behind, watching. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but the unease clung to me like a shadow. By the 3rd week, I couldn't take it anymore. Mark and I were having dinner when I brought it up again. "I really think someone is watching me, from that window, every night." He sighed, setting down his fork. "Emily, seriously? It's probably just your imagination. You've been stressed with the move, and it's a new place. Give it time. You're fine." But I wasn't fine. I didn't say it out loud, but I knew. The feeling of being watched was too strong, too persistent to ignore. I started staying up later, waiting to catch whoever, or whatever, was behind that curtain. Every time I'd check, the window was always the same. The curtain slightly parted, darkness beyond it. One night, I decided to step outside. I didn't tell Mark. I didn't need another lecture about overthinking things. I just slipped out the front door quietly and crossed the street. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood in front of the neighbor's house. Up close, the window felt different. Too quiet, too still. I stared at the gap in the curtain, waiting, hoping for some kind of explanation. But there was nothing. Just that same eerie stillness. I was about to turn back when the front door creaked open. An elderly man stood in the doorway, his face calm but with a strange, unreadable expression. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice cold. I swallowed hard, trying to find my words. I live across the street. I noticed your curtain. It's always open a bit, and, well, it feels like someone's watching." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, that's nothing. Just habit, I suppose. No one's watching you." There was something about the way he said it. His tone was too flat, too dismissive. I didn't believe him. I stood there for a second too long, caught between fear and curiosity, before muttering an awkward apology and heading back home. As I walked away, I could feel his eyes on me. After that night, something shifted in me. I couldn't look at the house across the street the same way. Every time I caught a glimpse of that window, I felt that man's empty smile lingering in the back of my mind. I tried to shake it off, convince myself it was nothing, but deep down, the unease started to crawl under my skin. It wasn't just the window anymore. It was everything. The way the light in the hallway flickered when I walked by, the creaking floorboards late at night, the feeling that the shadows in the room didn't quite match the objects around them. I started paying more attention to every little sound. Mark didn't notice, of course. To him, I was just overthinking, letting my nerves get the best of me. He worked late most nights, so I was alone in the house more often than not. I'd sit in the living room, staring at the muted TV, but my attention always drifted back to the window across the street. It was like a magnet for my eyes, pulling me in, daring me to look closer. I never could. One evening, while making dinner, I heard a noise behind me, a soft shuffle, like someone moving through the kitchen. My heart skipped a beat, and I spun around, only to find the room empty. The pan on the stove hissed as the oil bubbled, but everything else was still. I stood there, waiting for something to happen, anything to break the silence, but the house stayed quiet. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling, or maybe the wind outside. But I didn't believe it. Later that night, after Mark went to bed, I stayed up scrolling through old neighborhood forums, trying to dig up more about the old man. I found an article about a missing woman, the previous tenant of his house. She had disappeared 5 years ago without a trace. The police ruled it out as an isolated incident, no signs of foul play. Still, something about the way the article described her last known whereabouts, the same house across the street, made my skin crawl. Was it possible she saw something she shouldn't have? I closed my laptop and went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, the grainy photo from the article, staring back at me. I tossed and turned, feeling like I wasn't alone in the room. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see someone there, watching. But the curtains were drawn, and the room was dark. I tried to calm myself down, but the feeling wouldn't leave. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. The next day, I couldn't help myself. I walked across the street again, this time in broad daylight. I rang the doorbell, half hoping he wouldn't answer, but the door opened almost immediately. He stood there, looking the same as before, calm, with that same unsettling smile. "Back again?" he asked, his voice too smooth, too practiced. I cleared my throat. "I was just wondering about the woman who used to live here, the one who disappeared." His smile faltered for a second, just a flicker, but it was enough to send a chill through me. "That was a long time ago. No need to dwell on the past," he said, his tone clipped. I stood there, staring at him, waiting for more. But he didn't say anything else. I muttered a quick apology and left, my heart racing. As I walked back to my house, I could feel his eyes on me again, watching me the whole way. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up, pacing around the house, checking the windows, the locks, everything. I felt like a caged animal, trapped in my own home. Every sound, every creak in the floorboards felt like a warning, like something was waiting for me just out of sight. I could barely breathe. I kept thinking about that woman, about how she vanished without a trace. Would the same thing happen to me? By the time the sun started to rise, I was exhausted, but the feeling of dread hadn't gone away. In fact, it had only gotten worse. Something was wrong with that house, with that man. And I was going to find out what it was, no matter what it took. The following morning, I woke up to a suffocating sense of dread. I couldn't shake it, no matter how hard I tried. Every room in the house felt off, like something invisible had slipped in while I slept. I went through my usual routine, brushing my teeth, making coffee, but none of it felt real. My mind was elsewhere, fixated on that house and its secrets. I couldn't stop replaying the old man's expression when I mentioned the missing woman. That flicker of something dark in his eyes. It wasn't just my imagination. I was sure of it now. Mark left early for work, kissing me on the cheek like everything was normal. I barely responded, still lost in thought. "You're worrying too much," he'd said last night when I tried to bring it up again. But he wasn't the one living with the constant gnawing feeling that something was wrong. He wasn't the one watching shadows creep across the room in the middle of the night. I sighed, glancing at the clock. 10 a.m. I had the whole day to myself, and I needed to figure out what was going on. I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. Maybe getting out of the house would help clear my mind. But as soon as I stepped outside, I felt exposed, like someone was watching me. I found myself looking over my shoulder more than once, scanning the streets for anything out of place. But everything looked normal, too normal. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the distant hum of traffic filled the air, but none of it eased the tension in my chest. As I neared the old man's house, I slowed my pace, my heart pounding harder with every step. The curtains were drawn, as usual, and the house stood still, almost like it was daring me to come closer. My feet moved before my mind could catch up. I was standing in front of his driveway, staring up at that window, my hands trembling slightly. What was I hoping to find? Some sort of proof? But proof of what? I debated knocking on his door again. Part of me wanted to confront him, demand answers, but another part, the more rational part, screamed at me to walk away, to leave this whole mess alone before I got in too deep. I stood there, frozen, torn between the urge to know the truth and the fear of what I might uncover. Then I saw it, a flash of movement behind the curtains. My heart stopped. I wasn't imagining it this time. There was someone watching me. Without thinking, I took a step back, almost stumbling over my own feet. My pulse raced as I hurried back down the street, my eyes glued to the house, half expecting the door to swing open and the old man to come after me. But nothing happened. The house remained still, silent, like it was mocking me for running away. Back home, I locked the door behind me, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady my breathing, but the panic wouldn't go away. I needed answers. I couldn't keep living like this, in constant fear. Something wasn't right, and the longer I ignored it, the worse it got. I grabbed my laptop and sat down at the kitchen table, determined to find out more about the previous owner of the house. I scoured every website, every forum I could find, piecing together bits of information. The woman who lived there before had vanished without a trace, leaving behind no family, no friends to ask questions. Just gone, like she'd never existed. Hours passed, and I barely noticed as the sky outside darkened. It was getting late, but I couldn't stop. My eyes burned from staring at the screen, but I kept scrolling, reading, searching. There had to be more. Something that explained why I felt like I was being watched every second I stepped outside my door. Then I found it. A small, obscure blog post buried deep in a forgotten corner of the internet. It mentioned the house across the street, describing strange occurrences, flickering lights, cold drafts, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched. The writer claimed the house had a history, that it wasn't just the old man. Others who'd lived there before had experienced the same unsettling presence. Some had moved away, others had simply disappeared. As I read the chilling details in the blog post, a knot twisted in my stomach. Stories of disappearances surrounded the house like an invisible fog, each one more unsettling than the last. Why had I ignored the signs? The way the old man watched me, those flickering lights, it all began to connect in my mind, forming a web of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn deeper into something I didn't fully understand. Each detail felt like a warning, and yet I was too curious to back away now. I leaned back in my chair, trying to gather my thoughts. What if I was next? The blog post mentioned that some who lived there had felt an overwhelming urge to leave, but they often waited too long. It was as if the house had a way of trapping them, pulling them in until they couldn't escape. My hands trembled as I scrolled to the comments section, hoping for some answers. Instead, I found more fear. Others shared similar experiences, nightmares that felt real, whispers in the dark, and shadows that didn't belong. I couldn't believe it. Could it be true? Was I really experiencing the same things? I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breath. I wanted to convince myself it was all a figment of my imagination. But every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the trees outside, felt too real, too immediate. I could almost hear Mark's voice echoing in my head, urging me to let it go, to stop digging. But the more I pushed it away, the stronger my resolve grew. I had to confront this darkness. That night, the shadows seemed longer, the corners of our home darker. I climbed into bed, pulling the covers tight around me, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind raced with images of the old man's face, the stories I'd uncovered. Was he hiding something? My heart raced as I recalled the fleeting glimpse I'd seen behind the curtain. I imagined what he must have seen that day, the desperate look in my eyes, the fear I tried to hide. What would happen if I confronted him again? I needed answers, but I was terrified of what I might find. As the hours dragged on, I could hear the ticking of the clock, each second amplifying my anxiety. The silence in the house was punctuated only by the sound of my heartbeat, echoing in my ears. Finally, I sat up, my resolve hardening. I couldn't allow fear to control me. Tomorrow, I would visit the old man again, confront him, and demand the truth. Morning arrived, but I felt no relief. My stomach churned as I prepared myself to face him. I tried to convince myself it was just a conversation, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. I was stepping into a trap. After I took a deep breath, I left the house and made my way down the street. Each step felt heavy, like I was walking through mud. The world around me seemed eerily still, as if nature itself held its breath in anticipation. As I approached his house, the front door creaked open, revealing the old man standing there, his expression unreadable. "You're back," he said, his voice gravelly yet calm. A chill ran down my spine, but I forced myself to meet his gaze. "I need to know what happened here," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "You're hiding something, aren't you?" His eyes narrowed, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of surprise cross his face. "Some things are better left alone," he warned, his tone serious. "You don't know what you're asking for." I pressed on, frustration boiling inside me. "No, you don't get to decide what I can handle. I deserve to know." The air between us grew tense, charged with unspoken truths and buried fears. I could feel my heart pounding, the weight of my questions pressing down on me like a vice. The old man studied me for a moment, and then he sighed, stepping aside to let me in. As I crossed the threshold, a sense of foreboding washed over me. The interior was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the walls like fingers reaching out to grasp me. The room smelled stale, as if it hadn't been opened in years. "You have no idea what you're getting into," he said, closing the door behind us. Suddenly, I felt trapped, the weight of his words sinking in. I was crossing a line, and I didn't know what awaited me on the other side. But there was no turning back now. I had to face whatever darkness lay within these walls, and I had to do it before it consumed me completely. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, I felt an electric tension fill the air. The old man's house was cluttered, every surface adorned with items that looked like they belonged in a different time. Dust motes danced in the dim light, settling over pictures framed on the walls, faces of people who seemed to watch me with hollow eyes. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing toward a worn-out chair. I hesitated, every instinct screaming to run, but curiosity held me in place. "I want answers," I managed, my voice firmer than I felt. He settled into a chair opposite me, his gaze unwavering. "You've already seen more than you should," he replied, the weight of his words pressing down like a heavy fog. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. "I need to know about the disappearances. Why are they happening? What did you see?" The old man's expression darkened, shadows flitting across his features as he leaned closer. "It's not just disappearances, it's a curse," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Those who enter don't always leave." The weight of his revelation sank in, chilling my blood. I felt a chill creep up my spine as his words echoed in my mind. A curse? I had thought my fears were unfounded, just the wild imaginings of an anxious mind. But now, every creak of the floorboards seemed like an ominous reminder of the danger lurking within these walls. "What do you mean by that?" I pressed, a tremor creeping into my voice. "What do you know?" He glanced around the room as if searching for something hidden in the shadows. "Years ago, I lived in this house," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I witnessed things, terrible things. Those who come here searching for answers often find more than they bargained for." I leaned forward, gripped by a mixture of fear and intrigue. "What did you see?" "People who thought they could control it," he said, shaking his head. "But they were wrong. It feeds off fear, thrives on it. The house holds on to what it claims, and it doesn't let go easily." My heart raced. Each word was like a hammer driving nails into my resolve. I had come here seeking answers, yet all I felt was dread. "Why didn't you leave?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. His eyes darkened, and he hesitated, lost in a memory that seemed to haunt him. "I thought I could handle it. I was too curious, too stubborn." He looked directly at me, intensity burning in his gaze. But curiosity can be dangerous. It can lead you to things you're not prepared to face. I could feel the weight of his warning pressing on me. Was I prepared to face whatever was hidden here? Before I could respond, the room fell into a profound stillness. I could hear the ticking of a clock, each tick an echo of my rising anxiety. Then, a soft thud came from the back of the house, followed by an almost imperceptible whisper. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. "What was that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The old man's expression shifted, fear flashing across his face. "It's just the house," he replied, but I could hear the tremor in his words. "Just the house?" I echoed, disbelief spilling out. "You can't tell me that and expect me to believe it's normal." He sighed deeply, looking away as if the answer was too painful to bear. "You should leave," he said finally, his voice strained. "You're not safe here." I shook my head, defiance rising within me. I can't leave without knowing the truth. Suddenly, the front door burst open, revealing a figure cloaked in darkness. My heart raced as I stood frozen, the air around me thick with fear. "You shouldn't have come back," the shadowy figure said, voice low and menacing. The old man's face turned pale, his earlier confidence shattered. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," he shouted, rising to confront the figure. In that moment, clarity struck me like a bolt of lightning. The old man was not the one in control. He was just as trapped as I was. My mind raced, piecing together fragments of information I had ignored. The disappearances, the whispers, everything had led to this. I turned to run, but the figure lunged forward, and the world around me blurred into chaos. The house was not just a building. It was a living entity, and it had claimed another victim. As darkness engulfed me, I realized too late that I had underestimated the power of what I had encountered. The last thing I heard before everything faded was the old man's anguished cry. "It's too late." And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just a story of fear. It was my reality now, a twisted nightmare from which I might never awaken. Moving to Nashville for college felt like stepping into a fresh chapter of my life. I found a small, old house just off campus that was perfect for saving money. The rent was cheap, and I couldn't resist the allure of having my own space, away from the dorms. As I drove up to the weathered building, its peeling paint and creaky porch made it look like a scene from a movie. I shrugged off any reservations, telling myself that charm often comes with age. The moment I stepped inside, a rush of excitement mixed with unease washed over me. The air held a certain chill, but I chalked it up to the house being empty for so long. The layout was quirky. Rooms seemed to twist and turn unexpectedly, and each corner held a new surprise. I wandered through the narrow hallways, imagining how I'd arrange my furniture, and I felt a hint of satisfaction in my independence. Yet, there was an undercurrent of something unsettling, a whisper of doubt I couldn't shake. As night fell, shadows danced along the walls, stretching and retracting with the flickering light of my lamp. I had just settled down with a textbook when I heard it, a soft knock from the basement. My heart jumped. I paused, waiting for another sound, hoping it was just the old house settling. But then I heard it again, a deliberate tap, followed by a faint shuffle. I sat frozen, staring at the door, half convinced my imagination was playing tricks on me. "Get a grip, Lucas," I muttered to myself. "It's just an old house. It's probably the pipes or something." I tried to focus on my reading, but every creak of the floorboards beneath me felt like a reminder that I was alone in this strange place. I glanced at my phone, hoping to distract myself with a message from a friend, but the screen was silent. With a sigh, I tossed my book aside and went to check on the source of the noise. The basement door stood slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness. As I stepped closer, a cold draft swept past me, sending a shiver down my spine. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should just close the door and forget about it. But curiosity pulled me in, and I couldn't ignore the odd feeling that something was waiting for me down there. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The basement was dimly lit by the flickering bulb overhead. Dust particles floated in the air, glinting in the light. I swept my flashlight across the room, illuminating old boxes and forgotten furniture. The space felt vast, but there was an oppressive quality to it, as if the shadows had substance. I searched for signs of life, but all I found was silence. "It's just my imagination," I reassured myself, but a nagging voice whispered that I was wrong. Back upstairs, I tried to shake off the unease. I poured myself a cup of coffee, hoping it would chase away the chill that lingered in my bones. Yet, the shadows seemed to loom larger, and every creak of the house made my heart race. I glanced at my roommates, who were engrossed in their own worlds, oblivious to the tension coiling in my gut. Do you guys ever hear strange noises? I asked, attempting to sound casual. They laughed, brushing off my concerns as mere exaggeration. Come on, Lucas, it's an old house. You're just being paranoid, one of them chuckled. I forced a smile, but felt a tightening in my chest. Was I really imagining things? It was just an old place with its quirks, right? Yet, as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, a presence lingering just beyond my perception. As I closed my eyes, I promised myself I'd confront whatever was down there, convinced it was just my mind playing tricks. Little did I know, the truth would soon unravel, revealing a darkness far beyond my imagination. The next few nights felt like an exercise in dread. Every time I turned off the lights, the basement called to me with its rhythmic knocks and shuffles. My roommate Mark and I had been watching a movie when the first loud bang erupted from below. I jumped, my heart racing. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to mask the tremor in my voice. Mark laughed it off. "Dude, it's just the house being old. Chill out." But his nonchalance only deepened my unease. I tried to focus on schoolwork, but every creak of the floor or flutter of the curtains made me jump. I found myself avoiding the basement door, half expecting something to burst through. A sense of paranoia crept into my thoughts. What if someone was down there? Each time I looked at that door, my mind spiraled further into dark possibilities. I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me, shadows pooling in corners, eager to swallow me whole. One evening, as I attempted to study in the dim light of my desk lamp, I heard the softest whisper drift up from below. My skin prickled as I strained to listen. It sounded like someone calling my name. "Lucas," it floated upward, ghostly yet familiar. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it was my imagination. I wasn't ready to confront whatever it was, but the fear gnawed at me, relentless and insistent. "Hey, Mark," I yelled, hoping he'd come to my rescue. "Can you come here for a second?" He sauntered into my room, a bemused expression on his face. "What's up?" I gestured toward the basement door. "Did you hear anything weird?" He rolled his eyes. "Honestly, it's just your mind messing with you. You're too stressed about school." His dismissive tone stung, leaving me feeling isolated in my fear. I wanted to shake him, to make him understand that something was off. That night, sleep eluded me. I tossed and turned, the faintest sounds from the basement wrapping around my thoughts like a tightening noose. I thought about my parents and their comforting reassurances. I wanted to call them, but I feared they wouldn't understand. How could I explain the creeping dread I felt in my new home? "You'll be fine," they would say. "It's just an old house." But it didn't feel old, it felt alive, and it was watching me. By the weekend, the noises had escalated. The knocks had transformed into loud thuds, as if someone was pacing back and forth down there. Each time I gathered the courage to peek into the basement, I found nothing but the remnants of forgotten boxes and stale air. "What's wrong with you?" I thought, berating myself for letting fear take hold. "It's just a basement." Still, I could never shake the feeling of eyes on me, scrutinizing my every move. One evening, determined to confront whatever was causing the disturbances, I grabbed my flashlight and approached the basement door. "Just go in," I told myself. "You'll feel better once you know." I took a deep breath and pushed it open, the creaking hinges echoing in the quiet house. As I stepped onto the first step down, I felt a cold rush of air that sent a chill through me. I hesitated, clutching the railing tightly, forcing myself to take another step. The basement seemed larger than I remembered, the shadows deeper and more pronounced. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the room, the beam revealing the clutter of old furniture and forgotten treasures. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the feeling of being watched intensified. "This is ridiculous," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. I forced myself to walk further in, determined to uncover the source of my torment. Just as I was about to turn back, a loud crash echoed from the far corner. My heart stopped. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, illuminating a stack of boxes that had fallen over. "Okay, this is it," I told myself. "You have to get out." Panic surged, and I bolted back toward the stairs, but before I could reach them, I stumbled on something hidden in the shadows. I fell hard, the flashlight slipping from my grasp. As I lay there in darkness, I felt an overwhelming sensation of being trapped, as if the very walls were closing in around me. Panic surged through me as I lay on the cold floor, my flashlight flickering and casting erratic shadows. My heart raced, pounding against my ribcage as I fumbled to stand up. The echo of the crash lingered, merging with a new sound, a low, rhythmic breathing that felt too close for comfort. "This isn't happening," I told myself, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're just imagining things." But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I staggered to my feet, feeling my way through the darkness until my fingers brushed against the rough wooden wall. I needed to get out, to escape this oppressive space. As I reached for the stairs, the breathing grew louder, more pronounced. It was as if someone was waiting just out of sight. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound brave, but my voice cracked, betraying my fear. No response, just the steady rise and fall of that haunting breath. I glanced around, searching for my flashlight. It lay just out of reach, flickering weakly, as if teasing me with the possibility of illumination. With every step, the air felt thicker, heavier, like a thick fog clinging to my skin. "Get it together, Lucas," I scolded myself. "It's just your imagination, just an old house." But the words felt hollow, failing to reassure me. I was standing on the edge of something dark, and I didn't know how deep it went. Finally, I managed to reach my flashlight. I switched it on, the beam cutting through the gloom and revealing the room. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of life, any movement that could explain the presence I felt. The basement appeared empty, but the lingering chill in the air told a different story. I had to find out what was happening. "I can't let fear control me," I muttered, my resolve hardening. As I took a cautious step forward, a shadow flitted across the far wall, too quick to identify. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. "Is someone down here?" The silence that followed felt charged, almost electric. I strained to hear any response, but the only sound was my own heartbeat, racing in my chest. I had to know what I was dealing with. I took another step, my eyes glued to that dark corner, convinced something was lurking just beyond my sight. My mind raced, conjuring up images of intruders and worse. Maybe it's just some kids messing around, I thought, trying to rationalize my fear. But the deeper part of me knew this was more sinister than a simple prank. I thought of my roommates, how they brushed off my concerns, and wondered if they truly didn't hear anything. What if they were part of it? No, that's ridiculous, I reminded myself, shaking my head. They wouldn't do that. With renewed determination, I approached the corner where the shadow had moved. The floorboards creaked under my weight, a familiar sound that suddenly felt threatening. I shined my flashlight into the darkness, revealing nothing but a pile of old boxes. My chest tightened as I fought the urge to flee. I leaned closer, searching for signs of life, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "This is it, Lucas," I whispered, forcing myself to push through the fear. "Just look." And then I saw it, a small, half-open door set into the wall, barely noticeable behind a stack of forgotten junk. I hesitated, my gut screaming at me to turn back. What if it's just storage? I reasoned, but that feeling of being watched grew stronger, urging me to investigate. "You have to know," I told myself. I reached for the handle, my hand shaking as I turned it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow space filled with darkness. The smell of mold and decay wafted out, a suffocating aroma that made my stomach churn. I peered inside, my heart pounding. "Is anyone in here?" I called out, my voice echoing in the confined space. Silence answered me, but that thick sense of dread remained. I took a deep breath and stepped into the darkness, ready to confront whatever lay within. As I crossed the threshold, my flashlight illuminated what appeared to be remnants of a living space, an old mattress, empty cans, and a clutter of personal items. But my gaze froze on one item, a worn backpack, slightly ajar. The realization hit me like a cold wave. Someone was living here, I thought, my breath catching in my throat. I wasn't alone in this house. I had to find out who it was, and I had to do it now. As I stood in that cramped space, I felt the weight of my own fear pressing against me. My flashlight flickered, and shadows danced across the walls. The backpack, an ordinary object, now seemed sinister, filled with secrets I was terrified to uncover. I took a cautious step closer, my heart racing with each movement. What if someone comes back? I whispered to myself, the thought igniting a panic that twisted in my gut. But curiosity held me captive. I knelt beside the backpack and unzipped it slowly, the sound of the zipper echoing in the narrow room. Inside, I found a jumble of clothes, some crumpled papers, and a notebook. I hesitated, my mind racing with questions. What was this person doing here? My fingers trembled as I reached for the notebook, its cover worn and stained. I flipped it open, the pages yellowed and filled with scrawled notes. The handwriting was frantic, filled with erratic drawings and rambling thoughts. I see them watching me, one entry read, the ink smeared as if written in a hurry. They want me to leave, but I can't. I felt a chill run through me, and I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone lurking just outside the doorway. This is insane, I muttered, trying to shake off the unease. I had to focus. I needed to understand who was living in my basement. I flipped through more pages, the words growing darker with each entry. I can hear them at night, another note said, detailing eerie sounds that mirrored my own experiences. They know I'm here. My breath quickened. Had this person been living here before me? Was I now part of some twisted game? My thoughts spiraled, and I suddenly wished I had never come down here. I could almost feel the weight of their presence, pressing in from all sides. Just then, a noise from behind me made my skin prickle. A soft thud echoed through the room, sending my heart into a frenzy. Is anyone there? I called out, my voice shaky but determined. Silence answered me again. The tension grew, thickening the air around me as I gripped the notebook tightly, feeling its rough edges against my palm. I had to keep calm. There had to be a logical explanation for all of this. I turned back to the notebook, desperate to distract myself. One page caught my eye, doodles of faces and strange symbols that seemed to twist and writhe under my gaze. What is this? I asked aloud, feeling the unease creep back in. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was intruding on something sacred, a hidden world I had stumbled into unknowingly. This has to mean something, I thought, searching for a clue that could lead me to the truth. As I continued to read, a sense of dread wrapped around me like a cold shroud. The entries spoke of paranoia, of feeling trapped, and of being unable to escape the eyes watching from the shadows. I'm not alone here, I realized, a sinking feeling settling in my stomach. But who is it? I strained my ears, hoping to catch a hint of movement, a whisper of breath, anything that might indicate I wasn't the only one in this dark, confined space. Suddenly, a sharp noise shattered the stillness, a loud bang from above, followed by a creaking sound that echoed through the house. My heart raced as I glanced toward the door. What was that? I whispered, a sense of urgency washing over me. I needed to leave, to get out of this basement and away from whatever was happening in the house above. Yet my feet felt glued to the ground, the weight of the notebook pulling me back. Just then, I heard a voice, low and muffled. You shouldn't be here. The words sent chills racing down my spine. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't tell if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. Who's there? I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of something terrifying, caught between the desire to confront the source of my fear and the instinct to flee. The shadows around me seemed to thicken as I waited for a response, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. The room felt alive with unspoken threats, and I knew that I had to act fast. I grabbed the backpack and notebook, stuffing them inside my own bag. I have to get out, I thought, the urgency propelling me toward the door. I turned the handle slowly, my heart racing with anticipation and dread. Whatever was waiting for me outside, I knew I couldn't stay hidden any longer. As I reached for the door handle, the cold metal sent a jolt through my hand. I hesitated for a moment, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. What if it's just my imagination? I thought, trying to convince myself to stay put. Yet, the weight of the backpack felt heavy on my shoulders, urging me to escape. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever lay beyond. I pushed the door open, the creaking sound echoing in the dim light. My mind raced with possibilities. What if the person down there is right behind me? I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure emerging from the shadows. But the basement remained empty, the air thick with anticipation. I stepped cautiously into the hallway, each step echoing ominously in the quiet house. As I made my way upstairs, I could hear faint sounds from the living room. The TV murmured in the background, a mundane reminder of the life I had known just days before. "This isn't happening," I muttered, my thoughts spiraling. I needed to find my housemates, to tell them what was going on. But the gnawing feeling in my gut told me they might not understand it. Would they believe me? Or would they think I was losing my mind? The stairs creaked under my weight, each sound amplifying my anxiety. I pushed open the door to the living room, expecting to see the familiar faces of my friends. Instead, I was met with an unsettling scene. The room was empty, but the TV flickered, showing a static-filled image that seemed to pulse with energy. "Where is everyone?" I called out, my voice breaking slightly. I stepped further into the room, scanning for any sign of my housemates. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a rustling sound coming from the kitchen. My heart raced. "Hello?" I shouted, my voice more assertive this time. I felt like a fool, shouting into an empty house, but I had to know. I approached the kitchen cautiously, peering around the corner. "Guys, are you here?" No response. Just the soft hum of the refrigerator and that rustling sound, which grew louder, more frantic. I took a deep breath, my pulse quickening as I stepped into the kitchen. The table was cluttered with half-eaten food, as if someone had abandoned their meal in a hurry. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This is all too weird, I thought, my mind racing with possibilities. I scanned the room for any clues, any signs of where they could have gone. Then I noticed the back door was ajar, swinging gently on its hinges. I rushed toward it, my heart pounding. Maybe they went outside? I hoped, desperation creeping into my thoughts. As I pushed the door fully open, a chill ran down my spine. The backyard was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of streetlights in the distance. "Guys?" I called out, stepping outside. The night air felt different, charged with an unsettling energy that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. As I stepped onto the porch, I froze. In the corner of my eye, I saw a figure crouched low behind a tree. My heart dropped. "Is that?" I whispered, squinting to get a better look. The figure was still, almost as if it were watching me. "What are you doing?" I shouted, fear gripping my chest. The figure shifted slightly, and I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run. "Leave," the voice came, barely above a whisper but heavy with urgency. "You don't belong here." My mind raced. "Who are you? Why are you here?" I shouted, feeling anger surge through me. The figure straightened, revealing a disheveled man with wild eyes. "You don't understand," he said, panic in his voice. "They're coming for you." I felt a chill as the weight of his words sank in. "Who's coming?" I demanded, my voice trembling. Suddenly I heard a faint noise behind me, the sound of footsteps approaching. My stomach dropped as I turned around to face the darkness of the house. The shadows seemed to shift, merging into a form that felt all too familiar. "Get inside!" the man shouted, desperation lacing his tone. My heart raced as I stumbled back toward the door. I had to know what was happening, but terror gripped me. I was not alone anymore, and the horror I had been chasing was closing in fast. As I reached the threshold, the front door slammed shut behind me, and darkness engulfed the room. I spun around, panic clawing at my throat. "What's happening?" I shouted into the void. The man's eyes widened in fear as he pointed toward the back door. "You have to run," he urged, but I was frozen, caught in the web of confusion and dread. The house felt alive, the walls closing in, whispering secrets I could not understand. I've hesitated to share this story, mostly out of fear that no one would believe me. When I recount the events of that night, I often see the same skeptical expressions. They think I'm imagining things, that I'm just another fisherman with tall tales. But what happened was real, and it still haunts me. If I didn't have this experience, I wouldn't understand the depths of fear that lurk just beyond our vision. Living in Newport, Rhode Island, I've always felt a connection to the ocean. There's something about the salt in the air, the sound of waves crashing against the rocks, that feels like home. I spend my days fishing, navigating the waters that have shaped my life. But as I looked out at the horizon that fateful evening, I felt a storm brewing, not just in the sky, but something deep within me. The radio crackled with warnings of a cold front moving in, but I pushed those thoughts aside. I needed to catch one last haul before taking shelter. The sky grew darker, the clouds swelling like an angry beast, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to stay out just a bit longer. As I pulled in the nets, something strange began to happen. The radio, which usually buzzed with static, suddenly broke through with distorted voices. They were muffled, begging for help. I frowned, my heart racing. Was I hearing things? Hello? Is anyone out there? I spoke into the radio, but my voice felt lost, swallowed by the looming storm. The requests grew more frantic, almost desperate. Help us. We need you. The voices echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder of stories I'd heard of lost souls calling out from the depths. Was I being drawn into a tale of my own? The wind howled, and I found myself torn between the safety of my boat and the pull of those cries. My fingers tightened around the wheel, my gut telling me I should just turn back. But curiosity gnawed at me, and I couldn't ignore it. I set a course for the coordinates that flickered across the screen. As I drew closer, rain began to pelt the deck, and waves lashed against the sides of my boat. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat punctuated by the cries that continued to pour from the radio. Ryan, help us! My name rang out, unmistakable and chilling. Approaching the location, I spotted a boat drifting aimlessly, its hull battered and half submerged. My throat tightened as I pulled alongside. The sight that met my eyes was jarring. Blood stained the deck, and personal items lay scattered. A backpack, a shoe, a hat. It was clear there had been a struggle. I stepped cautiously onto the other boat, my senses heightened. Hello? Is anyone here? My voice felt fragile, swallowed by the storm. Each creak of the boat under my weight sent shivers down my spine. It was a scene straight out of a nightmare. The air around me felt electric, charged with something I couldn't quite grasp. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave, but I hesitated, drawn to the mystery. As I searched the cabin, the radio continued to crackle, begging me to stay. The storm raged outside, a tempest of nature reflecting the chaos in my mind. After what felt like an eternity, I finally turned to leave, my heart racing. But the voices didn't stop, they intensified. Ryan, come back! The urgency in their tone gripped me, paralyzing my limbs. I rushed back to my boat, the weight of their pleas pressing against me. As I sped away, I felt an unsettling sense of dread creep in. What had I just uncovered? Back on shore, I tried to shake the encounter from my mind, but the memory clung to me like a shadow, heavy and persistent. I had to know what happened to that crew, the voices echoing in my head like a cruel reminder of something lost. My journey was far from over. I was only beginning to understand the depths of what lay beneath the surface, both in the ocean and within myself. The days following that night were a blur. I tried to push the events from my mind, but the image of that abandoned boat kept resurfacing. I found myself standing by the water's edge, staring at the horizon, hoping to find some sense of peace. But peace was a distant memory. Each wave crashing against the shore seemed to carry whispers, echoes of the voices I had heard. Help us, they would say, haunting me. It felt as if the ocean itself was demanding answers. I decided to investigate further. Newport may be a small town, but it has its share of fishermen and maritime history. I approached some of the older fishermen at the docks, hoping they could shed light on what I had encountered. Ever hear of a boat going missing out there? I asked one grizzled man with a weathered face. He paused, eyes narrowing, then nodded slowly. Yeah, a few months back, a crew of 5. No sign of them since. My heart sank. I needed to know more. What happened? I pressed. He glanced around as if afraid of who might be listening. Rumors say they saw something in the water. No one knows for sure. They just disappeared. His voice dropped to a whisper, as if he was sharing a secret meant for my ears only. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn deeper into something sinister. I spent my evenings combing through old news articles and local reports. Each story added a layer of dread. The missing crew had been experienced fishermen, well respected in the community, but now they were just names on a list. I learned about their families, their hopes, their dreams, all cut short by a mystery that felt like a weight pressing down on me. I began to feel a strange kinship with them, as if their fate was somehow entwined with mine. As I dug deeper, the unsettling feeling in my gut only grew stronger. One night, sitting in my small living room, I replayed the recordings from my radio. The static was deafening, but I could still hear those voices, clearer now. Ryan, please. My name echoed in the air, making my skin crawl. Was it a trick of the mind? I couldn't escape the notion that someone or something was reaching out to me. The more I listened, the more personal the pleas felt. They weren't just calls for help, they were cries of desperation. My thoughts spiraled. What if I had the chance to save them? The storm I had experienced that night now seemed like a harbinger of something far more sinister. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, the salty breeze mixing with the smell of rain, my heart pounding in sync with the distant rumble of thunder. I returned to the docks, my mind racing with questions. I needed answers. I spoke to the Coast Guard, but their faces were as skeptical as the fishermen's. There's nothing more we can do. The boat's been logged as a missing vessel. The words felt like a dead end. I wasn't looking for closure. I was searching for the truth. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay awake, the darkness of my room pressing in, just like the water around that boat. My thoughts drifted back to the crew, to their last moments before vanishing. What were they thinking? Did they feel a flicker of hope as they called for help? I could almost see their faces, etched with fear. "I'm going back," I whispered to myself, heart racing at the thought. The idea of facing that storm again was terrifying, but I knew I had to find answers. Something deep inside me urged me forward, a compulsion I couldn't ignore. I grabbed my gear, determination flooding my veins. I would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The ocean held its secrets close, but I was ready to challenge whatever lay beneath its surface. With a final glance at the horizon, I set my course for the depths of the unknown, ready to confront the darkness that had been beckoning me all along. Each wave that crashed against my boat felt like a heartbeat, guiding me toward a truth that was both terrifying and tantalizing. Little did I know, the real horror was only beginning to unfold. The engine rumbled to life as I set out on the open water, the familiar scent of salt and sea air filling my lungs. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden glow across the waves. My heart raced with a mix of excitement and dread. I knew this journey would lead me into the unknown, but I couldn't turn back now. The whispers of the lost crew echoed in my mind, urging me forward. "Ryan," they seemed to call, "we need you." As I steered the boat toward the spot where the crew had vanished, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The vast ocean felt different tonight, as if it were alive and holding its breath. I scanned the water, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of what lay beneath the surface. The waves lapped gently against the hull, but my instincts screamed that something was wrong. I had no idea what was waiting for me in the depths. Arriving at the designated location, I cut the engine and let the boat drift. The water here was eerily calm, almost too still for comfort. I grabbed my flashlight and peered over the side, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. "If you're down there," I whispered, "show yourself." Silence hung in the air, thick and oppressive. The only sound was the occasional creak of my boat, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I leaned closer, heart pounding. At first, I thought it was just the play of light on the water. But then I saw it again, a shadow darting beneath the surface. What the hell was that? I muttered to myself, gripping the sides of the boat. I had come looking for answers, but the darkness was beginning to feel like a trap. I took a deep breath and decided to dive in. The cool water enveloped me as I plunged beneath the surface. It was darker than I expected, the light from above fading quickly. As I swam deeper, I felt an unsettling pull, as if something was drawing me down. The water swirled around me, and I fought to remain calm. Just a dive, I kept repeating, trying to quell my rising panic. My flashlight flickered, the beam struggling against the encroaching darkness. I caught a glimpse of something below, a shape, a figure, just out of reach. My heart raced, the urge to surface battling with the desire to uncover the truth. Is this it? I thought, dread washing over me. Is this how it ends? Suddenly, a surge of water pushed me upward. I resurfaced, gasping for air. The boat loomed above me, but the flicker of shadows was gone. I'm losing my mind, I thought, treading water and trying to regain my composure. The ocean was deceptively calm again, as if mocking my fear. I clung to the side of the boat, trembling as I looked around, half expecting something to emerge from the depths. I climbed back aboard, soaked and shivering, My heart raced, each beat echoing in my ears. I pulled out the radio, trying to regain my focus. "This is Ryan," I called out, hoping someone would respond, but the only reply was static, an endless drone that seemed to mock my desperation. "Anyone out there?" I tried again, frustration bubbling within me. Then I heard it, a faint crackle, followed by a voice. "Help us, Ryan." My stomach dropped as the words resonated in my mind. It was them. They were reaching out, and I had to do something. I couldn't ignore their pleas any longer. The stakes had escalated, and I was now part of something bigger than myself. As I steadied my breath, determination surged through me. I had to return to the shore and gather more information. I needed to speak with anyone who could help. The Coast Guard had brushed me off, but I would not let their doubt deter me. I would uncover the truth behind this mystery, no matter how deep I had to dive, figuratively and literally. The night was far from over, and I could feel the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on me. As I returned to shore, the chill of the ocean clung to my skin, reminding me of the uncertainty that awaited. Each step felt heavier, like the sand beneath my feet was trying to pull me back into the depths. The town was quiet, with only a few lights flickering in the distance. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, as if the shadows held secrets waiting to be uncovered. I headed straight for the local library, hoping to dig up anything related to the lost crew. Inside, the musty smell of old paper filled the air. I scanned the shelves, feeling drawn to a section that detailed local maritime history. I remembered a story I'd heard once about a fisherman who had gone missing decades ago under similar circumstances. They said he'd been searching for something, but no one knew what. I pulled a few books off the shelf and settled at a nearby table, flipping through the pages with urgency. "There has to be something here," I muttered to myself. Hours passed as I lost myself in the text. Suddenly, a phrase caught my eye: "lost souls beneath the waves." My heart raced. The story described fishermen hearing voices calling them back to the sea, luring them into its depths. I shivered at the thought. Was this what I had experienced? Were the voices I heard tied to these lost souls? Am I just another victim in this tale? I wondered, my thoughts spiraling. As I absorbed more of the tale, I felt an inexplicable connection to the fishermen. They had risked everything, driven by a force they couldn't understand. I couldn't help but think of my own motivations. Am I seeking answers, or am I just chasing ghosts? I whispered, the weight of the story pressing down on me. Each page turned felt like a descent into a deeper mystery, one I wasn't sure I was prepared to face. I decided to speak to the townsfolk, hoping they could shed light on what I had found. The local diner buzzed with chatter as I entered. I spotted an elderly man at the counter who looked like he had seen it all. "Excuse me, sir," I said, approaching him. "Have you heard about the fisherman who disappeared?" His gaze shifted, eyes narrowing. "You're digging into things best left buried," he warned. "Those waters have a way of claiming lives, Ryan." His words struck me. I felt a chill, as if he could see right through me. "But I need to understand. People need to know what happened," I replied, desperation creeping into my voice. He shook his head, eyes filled with a mix of pity and fear. "Some things are meant to stay lost, kid. Don't go looking for trouble." I left the diner, feeling the weight of his warning linger. It was clear that this mystery was not just mine to solve, it was a community's dark past. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay awake, tossing and turning, replaying the man's words in my mind. What if they were right? What if I'm provoking something I can't control? The shadows in my room seemed to dance, taunting me. I could almost hear the whispers from the ocean, beckoning me back. As dawn approached, exhaustion set in, and I finally drifted into an uneasy slumber. In my dreams, I was back on the boat, surrounded by water that shimmered under a silver moon. I felt a presence near me, and a voice whispered, "Help us." My heart raced as I recognized the tone, familiar yet distant. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The urgency surged within me again, compelling me to act. The voices weren't just figments of my imagination, they were a plea for help, echoing from the depths of the ocean. The following day, I gathered my gear, determined to return to the boat and face whatever awaited me. "This is it," I told myself, staring at the water's surface. The ocean's surface was deceptively calm, but deep down, I knew the truth. The shadows of the past loomed larger than ever, and I was ready to confront them. With each wave crashing against the boat, I felt the weight of history, a reminder that I was not alone in this struggle. As I prepared to set out again, doubt crept in. What if I don't find answers? What if this leads to something worse? But deep down, I knew I had to face the unknown. The voices were waiting, and I couldn't ignore their call any longer. With a deep breath, I started the engine, the familiar roar breaking the morning's quiet. This time, I wouldn't just be a bystander. I was stepping into the heart of the mystery, ready to uncover what had been hidden for far too long. As I steered the boat away from the dock, I felt a strange mix of determination and dread. The engine's roar shattered the morning calm, but it couldn't silence the voices in my mind. Each wave lapped against the hull like a warning, reminding me of the risks ahead. "You're doing this for them," I kept telling myself. "They deserve to be heard." But doubt nagged at the edges of my thoughts. Was I truly ready to face whatever lurked beneath the surface? As I approached the spot where I'd first heard the whispers, the water seemed to darken, a deep blue that felt almost alive. I anchored the boat and peered into the depths. What secrets lie below? I wondered, gripping the sides as if to steady myself. The ocean felt both inviting and threatening, a contradiction that mirrored my own emotions. Taking a deep breath, I leaned over the side, hoping to catch a glimpse of something, anything, that could lead me to answers. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I squinted into the water, my heart racing. "Did I just see something?" I muttered. The sensation was unnerving, like a cold hand brushing against my arm. I shook it off, convincing myself it was just the currents playing tricks. But deep down, I knew I was not alone. The feeling of being watched settled like a weight on my shoulders, heavy and persistent. I pulled out my camera, determined to document everything. Maybe I can capture something on film, I thought, flipping through the settings. The lens focused on the water, but my mind wandered. Memories flooded back of stories I'd heard about fishermen lost at sea, their boats swallowed whole by the waves. What if I'm following in their footsteps? I whispered, anxiety creeping in again. But I shook my head, dismissing the thought. I needed to stay focused. After a few moments, I decided to drop a line, hoping to connect with the water in a more tangible way. As I cast it, a chill wind blew through, sending a shiver down my spine. "Come on, fish," I joked, trying to lighten the mood. But my laughter felt hollow. The ocean was a vast, indifferent expanse, and I was just a small figure bobbing in its grasp. I waited, tension coiling within me like a spring ready to snap. Then, out of nowhere, a sudden splash erupted nearby. My heart jumped, and I turned to see what had disturbed the surface. To my horror, a face emerged from the depths. It was not human, not entirely. The figure stared back at me with hollow eyes, its expression one of sorrow and rage. "Help us," it mouthed, though no sound came forth. Panic surged through me. I fumbled for my camera, my hands shaking. "What the hell is happening?" I gasped, struggling to comprehend what I was witnessing. I had to get out of there. The weight of the figure's gaze felt suffocating. As I scrambled to start the engine, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a message, a warning not to meddle in things I didn't understand. "I'm just trying to help," I shouted, half-heartedly hoping it could hear me. But as the boat roared back to life, the figure vanished beneath the waves, leaving nothing but ripples behind. With my heart racing, I sped away from the haunting scene, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Was that real? I questioned, glancing back over my shoulder as if expecting it to reappear. The wind howled around me, almost mocking my fear. I was desperate for answers, but the deeper I dug, the more dangerous it felt. "What have I gotten myself into?" I muttered, gripping the wheel tightly. As I neared the shore, a storm began to brew on the horizon. Dark clouds swirled ominously, mirroring the chaos in my mind. I parked the boat and hurried to my car, ready to find safety. Yet as I drove through the town, whispers seemed to follow me, echoing in the wind. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, frustration boiling over. The locals glanced at me with pity, as if they knew more than they were letting on. Back at the library, I rifled through more books, hoping to find answers. I came across a passage about the town's history, detailing a tragic event involving a fishing crew that had vanished without a trace. "They were looking for something," I read aloud, my voice shaky. They sought treasure, but found only despair. The pieces began to align, revealing a pattern I couldn't ignore. Could this be the connection? I pondered, piecing together the history of loss that surrounded me. With a new sense of purpose, I realized I had to return to the water. But as night fell, an unsettling thought gripped me. What if the voices aren't just calling for help? The idea sent chills down my spine. What if they're calling me to join them? The realization that I might be part of a dark legacy struck me hard. I closed the book and looked out the window, knowing the ocean still held its secrets, waiting for the right moment to reveal them.